The word okay had never hurt me before. It was such a small word, harmless, ordinary. People used it every day without thinking twice. But the night my son sent me that single word, it landed like a stone on my chest. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, the house unusually quiet, the clock ticking loud enough to feel like it was mocking me. I had just sent him a long message, one of those messages you type slowly, carefully, rereading every line before hitting send. I told him I missed him. I told him the house felt empty without his laughter. I even apologized for things I wasn't sure I had done wrong, because that's what mothers do when they're afraid of losing their children. I waited, staring at my phone, watching the screen light up again and again with nothing but silence. Then finally his reply came. Just one word. Okay. No emoji. No follow-up. No warmth. Just okay. My hands trembled as I placed the phone on the table, as if it might burn me. That single word erased years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, late-night talks, and sacrifices I never counted because I never thought I'd need credit for them. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he was tired. But deep down I knew better. This wasn't about time. This was distance, emotional distance I hadn't noticed growing brick by brick, until a wall stood between us. As I sat there, memories flooded in uninvited. Him at 6 years old running into my arms after school. Him at 16 pretending he didn't need me anymore but still knocking on my door at midnight to talk. When did okay replace I love you, Mom? When did I become someone he responded to out of obligation instead of affection? I stood up and walked through the house, touching the backs of chairs, the door frames, the little things that once felt alive when he lived here. His room was still the same, untouched, as if time had paused the day he left. I sat on his bed and felt something crack inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way things truly break. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed every conversation, every argument, every moment I might have pushed too hard or said the wrong thing. And somewhere between guilt and grief, another feeling crept in. Something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Anger. Not loud anger. Not screaming anger. But a cold, steady realization that I had spent my entire life giving, adjusting, forgiving. And now I was being reduced to a single dismissive word. Okay. By morning I knew one thing for sure. That word was not the end of a conversation. It was the beginning of a truth I had been avoiding for far too long. The next morning arrived without rest, my eyes burning from a night spent staring at the ceiling, replaying that single word over and over again as if repetition might soften its meaning, but it didn't. Instead, it grew heavier, sinking deeper into my chest with every passing hour. I made coffee out of habit, not desire, letting it go cold on the counter while I stood by the window watching the street wake up. Families heading out together, parents walking their children to school, scenes that once mirrored my own life and now felt like reminders of something I had lost without realizing when or how. I picked up my phone again, my thumb hovering over his name, tempted to send another message, something light, something casual, maybe even a joke, just to prove to myself that I still mattered enough to deserve more than okay. But pride, the kind I had neglected my entire life as a mother, finally whispered that I should stop chasing affection that wasn't being offered freely. As the hours passed, memories surfaced not gently but forcefully. The times I had canceled my own plans because he needed help, the years I stayed awake worrying when he didn't come home on time, the silent sacrifices that never made it into conversations because love, to me, had never been transactional. And yet, somewhere along the way, that unconditional love had quietly turned into expectation. His expectation that I would always be there, always available, always understanding, no matter how little he gave in return. Around noon, I found myself standing in front of an old photo album, my fingers tracing images of birthdays, graduations, holidays where my smile was wide and his arms were wrapped around my shoulders, moments frozen in time that contradicted the present so sharply it made my chest ache. I wondered if he remembered those days the way I did, or if they had faded into background noise for him, replaced by a new life where I existed only on the edges. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. It wasn't that he hated me, it was worse, he didn't think about me at all. By the afternoon, something inside me shifted, subtly but permanently. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations where he suddenly understood and apologized. Instead, I began to see myself not just as a mother waiting for validation, but as a woman who had spent decades defining her worth through someone else's needs. And as uncomfortable as that truth was, it carried a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. What would my life look like if I stopped measuring my value by how quickly my son replied to my messages? The thought scared me, but it also sparked something close to hope, a fragile idea that maybe this painful silence was not punishment, but an invitation to finally reclaim the parts of myself I had set aside, believing I would return to them someday, never imagining that someday might arrive wrapped in a single careless word. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in muted shades of orange and gray, I realized how quiet the house had become. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the hollow silence that echoes when there's no one left to speak to. I moved from room to room, turning on lamps I didn't really need, just to push back the darkness, both outside and inside me. Every object seemed to carry a memory. The couch where he used to sprawl with his feet on the cushions despite my scolding. The dining table where he once argued passionately about his dreams, insisting he would build a life so big there'd be room for all of us in it. I sat down and allowed myself, for the first time, to feel the grief I had been avoiding. Not the dramatic kind with tears and sobs, but the slow, aching grief of realizing that the future I had imagined was no longer aligned with reality. I wasn't grieving the loss of my son. I was grieving the version of him I believed would always show up for me. The one who would check in just because, who would care enough to ask how my day had been. As I stared at the blank television screen, my phone buzzed again, and for a split second my heart leaped with hope, only to fall just as quickly when I saw it was a notification from an app one barely used. That brief rise and fall of emotion embarrassed me. It revealed how deeply I was still tethered to his attention, how easily my mood could be lifted or crushed by a screen lighting up. I thought back to my own parents, to how I once promised myself I would never make my child feel the way they had sometimes made me feel, unheard, overlooked, taken for granted. And yet here I was, facing the same cycle from the other side, wondering where I had gone wrong, or if this was simply the cost of loving too deeply. Late into the night, I made myself a simple dinner and ate alone at the table. No background noise, no distractions, just the clink of cutlery and my own thoughts for company. It was uncomfortable but also honest. In that stillness, I began to understand something important. Waiting for him to change was keeping me trapped in a version of life that no longer existed. I couldn't force him to care the way I needed, and I couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit into the small space he left for me. The realization didn't bring instant peace, but it brought resolve. If he was choosing distance, then I would choose dignity. I would stop reaching out just to be met with indifference. Stop explaining my pain to someone who wasn't listening. That night, before going to bed, I turned my phone face down on the nightstand, not as an act of anger, but as a quiet promise to myself, that from this moment forward, my happiness would no longer depend on a response that might never come. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through thin curtains that softened the light but did nothing to ease the heaviness pressing on my chest. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I was rested, but because my mind refused to stay quiet, replaying conversations from years ago as if they were clues I had somehow missed. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic, realizing how much my life had shrunk without me noticing. Everything had gradually begun revolving around short messages, delayed replies, and excuses I pretended to accept even when they hurt. I got out of bed and went through my routine on autopilot, brushing my teeth, washing my face, making coffee, yet every action felt strangely detached, like I was watching myself from the outside. As I sat at the kitchen table with my mug warming my hands, I remembered the years when mornings were loud and chaotic, filled with hurried breakfasts, complaints about school, and last-minute searches for missing shoes. Back then, I used to dream of quiet mornings, of having time to myself, never imagining that silence could feel this isolating. The coffee tasted bitter, but I drank it anyway, thinking about how often I had swallowed bitterness in other forms, disappointment, worry, loneliness, without complaint. I checked my phone again against my better judgment, scrolling through old messages, noticing how the balance had shifted over time. My long paragraphs full of concern and warmth, his brief responses growing colder, shorter, more distant. It struck me that I had been negotiating for basic respect, dressing it up as patience, telling myself that all relationships go through phases. Maybe they do, but somewhere along the way I had stopped being a priority and started being an obligation. That realization hurt more than any argument ever could. I decided to leave the house, hoping fresh air might clear my head, and took a slow walk through the neighborhood. The trees were bare, their branches reaching toward the sky like open hands, and I couldn't help but see myself in them, exposed, stripped of expectations, still standing. I passed familiar houses where I once visited friends, people who had slowly drifted away as my world narrowed to family responsibilities. I wondered when I had last done something purely for myself, without guilt or justification. As I walked, memories surfaced uninvited. Standing in the rain at school events, clapping the loudest. Staying up late to help with projects I barely understood. Defending him when others criticized his choices, insisting he just needed time. I had given freely, believing love was measured by how much you were willing to endure. But walking there alone, I began to question that belief. Was love supposed to feel like constant self-erasure? Was it noble to keep giving when nothing came back? Or was it simply fear of being alone? By the time I returned home, my legs were tired but my thoughts were sharper. I sat down and opened a drawer where I kept old photographs, flipping through images that captured moments of joy I clung to as proof that things were once different. And they were, but people change, and sometimes they change in ways that no amount of love can reverse. I realized I had been holding on to those memories not to honor them, but to avoid accepting the present. That afternoon I did something small but meaningful. I made a list. Not of grievances, not of regrets, but of things I wanted for myself moving forward. Peace, honesty, mutual respect, laughter that didn't feel forced. Writing those words felt awkward, almost selfish, yet also strangely empowering. For the first time in a long while, my future didn't revolve around waiting for someone else to show up. It revolved around reclaiming parts of myself I had quietly set aside. As evening approached, the familiar ache returned, but it was different now, less raw, more thoughtful. I understood that healing wouldn't be quick or dramatic. It would be slow, made up of moments like these, where I chose awareness over denial. I couldn't rewrite the past or control his choices, but I could decide how much access he had to my emotional world. And as I turned off the lights that night, I felt something new settle in, not happiness, not relief, but a steady sense of self-respect beginning to take root, fragile yet real, like the first sign of growth after a long, unforgiving winter. The next few days passed in a quiet blur, but beneath the calm surface, something inside me was steadily shifting. I noticed it in small ways at first, how I no longer jumped at every notification, how I didn't immediately assume silence meant my fault, how I began to sit with my thoughts instead of running from them. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork, I came across documents I hadn't looked at in years. Insurance papers, school records, handwritten notes reminding myself of appointments and responsibilities I once carried alone. Each page was evidence of how much I had managed without applause, without acknowledgement, without even being asked if I was tired. I remembered nights when I stayed awake worrying about everyone else's future while ignoring my own present, telling myself that sacrifice was simply part of being a parent. But as I held those papers in my hands, I felt a quiet anger rise. Not explosive, not destructive, but clear and focused. It wasn't anger at my son alone. It was anger at myself for believing that love required me to disappear. I sat down on the floor, surrounded by these fragments of my life, and let the emotions come without pushing them away. There was grief for the relationship I thought I had, disappointment for the future I imagined, and a deep sadness for the version of myself who kept hoping things would change without setting boundaries. Later that evening I cooked dinner just for myself, something simple, but I plated it carefully, as if to remind myself that I deserved effort too. As I ate, I thought about how often I had rushed meals, standing at the counter or eating cold leftovers, because someone else needed something more urgently. That realization stayed with me long after the dishes were done. The phone rang that night, and for a moment my heart jumped instinctively. But when I saw it wasn't him, I felt relief instead of disappointment. That surprised me. It told me that I was slowly detaching, not out of bitterness but out of self-preservation. Before going to bed, I wrote again in the same notebook from earlier, this time about boundaries, what they meant, why they scared me, and why I needed them. I acknowledged that setting limits didn't mean I loved less. It meant I loved myself enough to stop accepting pain as normal. Lying in bed, I reflected on how society often praises endurance, especially from parents, without ever questioning the cost. We are taught to give endlessly, to forgive repeatedly, to wait patiently, but rarely are we told that it's okay to step back when something hurts too much. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it felt deeper, steadier, as if my mind finally allowed itself to rest. I didn't know what the future held, whether reconciliation was possible or whether distance would grow. But for the first time, uncertainty didn't terrify me. It felt honest. And in that honesty, I sensed the beginning of a new chapter. One where my worth wasn't measured by how much I endured, but by how bravely I chose myself. The following morning began differently, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because I woke up without the familiar heaviness pressing down on my chest. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, yet unmistakably real. For years, my days had started with a mental checklist centered around other people, who needed help, who might call, who might be upset with me. But that morning, the silence felt neutral instead of threatening. I brewed my coffee slowly, watching the steam rise, and realized I wasn't waiting for a message that might ruin my mood. That realization alone felt like a small victory. I carried my mug to the window and stood there, observing the quiet street below, thinking about how many mornings I had spent bracing myself for disappointment before the day even began. I used to believe that constant worry was proof of love, that if I stopped worrying, I would somehow be failing as a parent. But now, with the sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor, I questioned that belief for the first time. Was love really supposed to feel like a permanent state of anxiety? As the day unfolded, I kept myself busy with things I had neglected for years: small repairs around the house, a walk around the neighborhood, even a short visit to a local cafe I had always passed but never entered because it felt unnecessary. Sitting there alone, listening to conversations that had nothing to do with my life, I felt both invisible and strangely free. No one needed anything from me. No one expected me to fix a problem or absorb emotional weight. I thought about how rarely I allowed myself to exist without purpose for someone else. That absence of obligation felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, yet deeply restorative. It was as if my nervous system was slowly learning a new rhythm, one that didn't revolve around tension and anticipation. Later that afternoon, I received a message from my son. It wasn't long or emotional, just a few lines asking if everything was okay, likely prompted by my recent silence. I stared at the screen for several minutes, noticing how my body reacted. There was no rush, no panic, no urge to explain myself or smooth things over. For the first time, I understood that I didn't owe an immediate response simply to ease someone else's conscience. When I finally replied, I chose my words carefully, not to provoke or punish, but to be honest without over-explaining. I said I needed some time and space to think, and that I would reach out when I was ready. Pressing send felt terrifying and empowering all at once. I half expected guilt to crash over me, but instead there was a calm resolve, as if I had finally spoken in a language my heart had been practicing quietly for years. As evening approached, memories surfaced, moments I had buried because they didn't fit the story I wanted to believe. I remembered past conversations where my feelings were dismissed, times when my efforts were taken for granted, and occasions when my silence was interpreted as consent. I realized how often I had minimized my pain to preserve harmony, convincing myself that confrontation would only make things worse. But avoiding discomfort hadn't protected me. It had only delayed the inevitable reckoning. Understanding that brought both sorrow and clarity. I wasn't angry anymore in the way I once was. Instead, I felt a deep compassion for myself, for the version of me who believed endurance was the same as strength. That night, I sat with the notebook again, this time writing about what I wanted the next phase of my life to look like. Not in grand, unrealistic terms, but in simple, grounding ones. Peace in my own home, conversations that didn't leave me drained, relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation. I acknowledged that these changes might make some people uncomfortable, and that was something I would have to accept. Growth, I was learning, often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. As I closed the notebook, I understood that reclaiming myself didn't require cutting anyone off completely. It required redefining access to my time, energy, and emotions. Before going to bed, I turned off my phone, something I rarely did before. In the quiet darkness, I reflected on how far I had come. Not in years, but in awareness. Healing, I realized, wasn't a dramatic transformation but a series of small, deliberate choices made in moments when no one was watching. I didn't know how my relationship with my son would evolve, or whether distance would bring understanding or deeper separation. But for the first time, I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. And that trust, fragile yet steady, felt like the most meaningful gift I had given myself in a very long time. In the days that followed, something subtle but profound continued to shift inside me, like the slow turning of a tide that had been stuck for years. I began to notice how much of my identity had been built around being available, agreeable, and endlessly accommodating. It wasn't something anyone explicitly demanded. It was a role I had stepped into quietly, believing it was the safest way to keep love close. But now, with space between myself and the constant pull of expectations, I could finally see the cost of that role. I replayed conversations in my head, not to dwell on resentment but to understand patterns, how often my needs were brushed aside with jokes, how frequently my concerns were labeled as overthinking, and how easily my sacrifices were reframed as obligations rather than choices. These realizations didn't arrive all at once. They came gently, almost tenderly, as if my mind knew I could only handle the truth in measured doses. One afternoon, I found myself sorting through old photographs stored in a box at the back of the closet. Images of birthdays, holidays, school events, and family gatherings stared back at me. Moments where I was always present, always smiling, always positioned slightly to the side as if my role was to support the scene rather than be at its center. Looking at those pictures now, I didn't feel bitterness. Instead, I felt a quiet grief for how invisible I had allowed myself to become. I remembered how often I stood in the kitchen during celebrations, listening to laughter from another room, telling myself that being needed was enough. But being needed, I finally understood, is not the same as being valued. That distinction settled deep within me, reshaping how I viewed both my past and my future. That evening my son called. The sound of his voice stirred something familiar. An instinct to soften, to reassure, to make everything okay again. For a brief moment, I considered slipping back into old habits, offering comfort before asking for understanding. But I paused. I let him speak first, listened without interrupting, without rehearsing my response. When there was silence, I spoke calmly, explaining how his words and actions over the years had affected me. Not accusingly, not dramatically, just honestly. There was resistance at first, a defensiveness I recognized well, followed by an uncomfortable quiet. I didn't rush to fill it. I let the silence exist, even though it made my hands tremble. That silence felt like a turning point, a moment where I chose truth over peacekeeping. After the call ended, I didn't feel relieved or devastated. I felt grounded. I realized that no matter how he processed the conversation, I had finally honored my own experience. For years, I had believed that maintaining closeness required swallowing pain. But now I understood that real connection could only survive where honesty was allowed to breathe. If that honesty led to distance, then perhaps that distance was necessary for both of us to grow. This thought scared me, yet it also carried a strange sense of acceptance. I was no longer fighting to control outcomes, I was learning to trust the process. As night fell, I reflected on how resilience is often misunderstood. People admire strength when it looks like endurance, but they rarely recognize the courage it takes to change. Choosing myself didn't erase the love I had for my son. It simply redefined it. Love I was discovering doesn't mean endless self-sacrifice. It means mutual recognition, boundaries that protect rather than punish, and the willingness to evolve even when it's uncomfortable. I acknowledged that I might feel lonely at times, that stepping out of familiar roles often comes with isolation. But loneliness, I realized, was something I could survive. Losing myself was something I no longer could. Before sleeping, I wrote one final line in my notebook. I am allowed to take up space in my own life. Reading it back, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. Whatever came next, reconciliation, distance, or something entirely unexpected, I knew I was finally standing on my own emotional ground. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The morning light felt different when it streamed through my window the next day, softer somehow, as if it were meeting me where I finally stood instead of shining past me. I woke with a calm I hadn't felt in years, not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from no longer fighting myself. I made my coffee slowly, savoring the small ritual, noticing how quiet the house felt without that familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. For so long, my days had begun with a silent inventory of everyone else's needs, worries, and expectations. Now, for the first time, I asked myself a simple question. What do I need today? The answer wasn't dramatic or grand. It was honesty. It was rest. It was space to breathe without guilt. Over the following weeks, the changes weren't loud or obvious, but they were real. I stopped explaining myself excessively. I let calls go unanswered when I wasn't emotionally ready. I declined invitations that felt more like obligations than joy. At first, this new way of living felt foreign, even selfish, but with each small decision, I felt myself growing steadier. Some people noticed. A few questioned it. Others pulled back slightly, unsure of how to interact with this version of me that no longer bent automatically. I accepted all of it. Not every relationship is meant to survive change, and that realization, once terrifying, now felt strangely freeing. My son reached out again weeks later. This time the conversation was different, not perfect, not magically healed, but different. There was less defensiveness, more listening. He didn't apologize in the way I once imagined he would, but he acknowledged things he had never acknowledged before. And I understood something important in that moment. Closure doesn't always look like an apology. Sometimes it looks like clarity. Sometimes it's simply knowing you spoke your truth and refused to abandon yourself in the process. I didn't need him to fully understand my pain for it to be valid. I just needed to stop denying it. As time passed, I began rediscovering parts of myself that had been quietly waiting in the background. Interests I had set aside, friendships I had neglected, even moments of solitude that now felt nourishing instead of empty. I started walking in the evenings, watching the sky change colors, reminding myself that life keeps moving forward whether we're ready or not. And maybe that was the lesson hidden inside all of this. We don't wait for permission to reclaim our lives. We choose to do it even when it's messy, even when it disappoints others. Looking back, I no longer see myself as someone who was weak for enduring so much. I see someone who loved deeply and learned slowly and painfully. Where love must end and self-respect must begin. There is no bitterness in that understanding, only wisdom earned the hard way. I know now that setting boundaries doesn't erase love. It reshapes it into something healthier, something sustainable. And if love cannot survive honesty, then it was never meant to be carried alone. Today, when I think about the future, I don't picture it in terms of who will need me or who might leave. I picture moments, quiet mornings, honest conversations, laughter that doesn't require sacrifice, and peace that doesn't come at the cost of my voice. I don't know exactly what lies ahead, but I know who I will be walking forward as. Someone who chooses herself without apology. Someone who understands that her worth was never dependent on how much she could endure. If there's one thing I would say to anyone who sees themselves in my story, it's this. It's never too late to step out of a role that is shrinking you. You don't have to burn bridges or rewrite the past. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to stand still and say, this is where I stop losing myself. That choice doesn't make you unkind. It makes you whole. And from that place of wholeness, whatever comes next, reconciliation, distance, or a new beginning entirely, will finally be built on truth.